What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. The Sinnoh region has many great things to appreciate. Plenty of charming towns, a robust underground to explore, and of course a cornucopia of cross-gen evolutions. Some of those even took unexpected turns with their typings. But what if they didn't create new type pairings and made all of the Sinnoh Pokémon only a single type? It should be fun to see how each Pokémon would change if it had to lean only one way, embodying a singular element. So, as always, we begin with our trusty grass starter, but Turtwig and Groddle are already just one type. So that takes us to Torterra, and hey, I heard you guys last time saying that it was foolish to change the starters and remove their perfect balance. That is a good point, but I'm gonna do it again anyway. I think you're all forgetting the excitement in this scenario of training a Pokemon for so long for it to suddenly change, opening up a new world of opportunities that it never could have had as the previous type. So Torterra is a microcosm of the entire world. You're telling me that's not ground enough somehow? And we see with Regigigas that plants don't automatically make you a grass type, and I would then do the same for Infernape becoming a fighting type, and likewise I would say Empoleon becomes a steel type to make it a completely unique starter trio. And yes, that means Empoleon would be weak to the other two, but you're forgetting that it would still have all of the water, not to mention ice and flying attacks that it could still learn as a Piplup and Prinplup, so it would have means of fighting back. And before you complain, remember that this is the setup that we have now. We just dropped their original typing. So don't take the imbalance up with me, this is just how the Sinnoh starters are designed. Then we have the Starly line, who is one of my favorites, and of course they would be pure flying types. I could see Starly becoming normal if you really wanted to, but Staraptor has such a streamlined profile and slices through the air so effortlessly that it has to be flying. Now, Bidoof is of course a normal type, but what does that mean for Bibarel? I would say the evolution should dive in the deep end and be a water type. Not only does this fit with its beavery ways, it helps to justify the evolution in the first place. Plus, it gives us a replacement fully evolved water type early in the game because we kind of lost ours. Then we trickle down to Badoo, who would definitely be grass. I mean, I made Roselia grass last time, and Badoo is even simpler and far less toxic than that. And as much as I would love to give Roserade poison instead, I think it makes more sense to stay grass, since it's basically a plant persona character with bouquets, but also poison isn't nearly as scarce as the last couple of regions either. Okay, so the first fossil is actually uniquely monotyped already, so that means Shieldon is next, who would obviously get the steel type. I mean, it's got a giant face made of solid metal, and as we just mentioned, its counterpart is already a rock type, so forcing them to be the same would be redundant. The bagworm Burmy is awful, but it also causes a lot of work, because Wormadam can have 3 different type combinations, or at least it did, but given their obvious cloaks, I think one being the grass type, one of them being ground, and one being steel would work. I'm still not convinced that the trash one needed to be steel in the first place, so I could see an argument for Bug. Burmy also evolves into Mothim, and while I could also see reasoning for Bug, I do think that it would be nice for Burmy to get a flying stage to contrast the others, effectively making Burmy the next Eevee, which would be a huge boost in its profile that it really kind of needs. It also helps to set it apart from the next pairing of Combee and Vespiquen, who I would recommend for the Bug type. Since they are made up of multiple bees put together, I feel like that's more important than their wings, and Vespiquen's royal status seems to mean a lot more for her to be the queen over the Bug type than it would be over flying. Then we move over to Gastrodon, who I would easily leave water. I'm not entirely sure what's so ground about them anyway, but even if I did see it, they're basically identical to Shellos, and those ones get away with being pure water types with some ground attacks thrown on top, so that should be good enough for the bigger sea slugs as well. But then I'm pretty excited for the Drifloon line because they are clearly flying types. They're just regular balloons. The only thing ghostly about them is their lore, not their designs. But I just love that there are more undisputed flying types besides just some birds. But speaking of, the next one in line is Honchkrow, who will become a dark type this time. This falls in line with how we handled Murkrow and Johto, but it's also turned into a Mafia boss, so if it wasn't dark before, it clearly is now, so this doubly works for me. However, I do think the Stunky family would likely go the other way, staying poison types instead. I can see why they were dark before, that's not a problem, but I feel like the notorious Skunk Stench is clearly more poisonous in nature than downright evil. But then we have Bronzor and Bronzong, and I don't think there's any question that they would be Steel types. Not that a Psychic type couldn't have Metal, but these are completely made of steel, living metal. So I feel like they could float using magnetism instead of ESP, and it would work just the same. And actually, that would make a lot more sense for them to live at Mount Coronet that way too. I kind of forget that Mime Jr. counts now, and it would be pretty easy to revert to Psychic, but I do think that Fairy should probably show up in Sinnoh somewhere, and I really could see this cute little clown being Fairy, but turning Psychic only once it evolves. Now Chatot is an interesting case, because we usually make birds flying, but I think Normal is actually a better fit, since as many fans will tell you, the Normal type is a sort of stand-in for a Sound type. And with Chatot being all about sound and music, that means Normal is perfectly harmonious here. But Spiritomb is a bit more difficult. I could see it going either way, but I think it's only fair to have it be Ghost. It's famously made up of 108 individual spirits that haunt the Keystone, so that pretty heavily outweighs the potential dark if you ask me. Now, as much as I love the idea of making Garchomp a super powerful ground Pokémon, I think Dragon is a necessity as they are the only non-legendary dragons in the entire region. That takes us to Lucario, and come on, he's definitely a fighting type. I mean, a couple of spikes are not enough to make it a Steel type over its whole aura gimmick, which heavily leans into the fighting side of things. This one is quite easy to place, but the discussion is a bit more open for the next ones because Skorupi could be argued to be Bug, but I think Poison would suit it better. Just the same way that Gligar is a Scorpion but doesn't require the Bug type, I expect Skorupi could be quite well off as an embodiment of the Poison type. That said, I would change Drapion to become a Dark type. It clearly gets more aggressive when evolving. It's also good to shake things up from the other fully evolved Poison types throughout the Sinnoh region, like the Krogunk line. I think these toxic frogs would effortlessly blend into Poison a lot better than they would fighting. I mean, Drapion could be considered dark a lot more than these frogs are fighting types, so Toxicroak using its Venom Sacs and Poisoned Claws simply points in one direction, and I think it's pretty clear which one. After that, we see Mantike, who will fall in line as a flying type. Just like its Gen 2 relative, I think its ability to soar into the air would be nice to highlight so that surfing has a little bit more variety instead of just water types everywhere. Then we have the frosty trees, Snover and Abomasnow, who I think make sense to be ice types. The botanical Yeti especially doesn't really have that much grass about it. It's clearly overtaken by the ice, which works out great for us because we actually have precious few of them in the region, and the upcoming Pokemon won't really help, because I would recommend Weavile be a dark type instead. Not only have we called a few too many dark types in Sinnoh so far, but I think it works even better since I made Sneasel an ice type. So this only amplifies the nefarious turn that this Pokemon has taken to be more openly malicious. Sort of the opposite of Abomasnow just before, but that does mean that we are officially entering the cross-generational evolutions. So now we have Magnezone, and of course this is an easy Steel type. It's a giant UFO thing, and magnetism is a lot more tied to Steel than electric anyway, which they can always have as just a ton of coverage moves to alleviate its absence if you want. I don't really like Rhyperior, but I do like the idea of it becoming a rock type. If you don't remember, in this monotyped scenario, the first two were ground types, but I think the Protector item adding on excessive armor, turning it into a rock type aligns perfectly, and sort of justifies creating this evolution in the first place, you know, unlike now. And with Togekiss, it is quite tempting to lean into the flying angle, since it's mostly wings now. But like I said, we got no fairy here, so it needs to be our representative. And again, that does keep the theme going from the previous Gen 2 stages. But to make up for it, I am gonna make Yanmega flying instead. Even if you don't think that Yanma should have been flying, its Mega form grew even more wings to increase its aerial mobility. So don't insult the man by insisting he's just a bug. However, Gliscor will switch over to ground. He could only glide anyway, so the flying type was spurious at best, but as an airborne ground type, Gliscor broadens the scope of what we perceive the element to be. And actually, I think that Mamoswine could be ground too, but for different reasons, because while the previous two were ice, I think to rationalize them turning into a mammoth, it should become a more fossil-like type. And yes, I know it's not a rock type, But hey, most of the fossils aren't in this monotyped world, but it does evolve with ancient power, so I think this is a good way to help Mamoswine stand out from the rest of its line. Now, as we alluded to last time, Gallade will of course be fighting. It just clicks so well to have the Ralts line split into completely separate types in their final evolutions, and the fighting is what justified making Gallade in the first place, so it all works. And of course, then Probopass will be Steel. You could honestly just follow the exact same magnet logic that we used for Magnezone, but it clearly is metallic over the stone that Nosepass used to be. As for Frostlass, I would offer the same advice as Gallade and make it a ghost type. Glalie is already pure ice, it's surprisingly never been dark despite what people think, so having Frostlass be ice would make it a pointless addition, really. But that also doesn't mean this creepy ghost can't call up a few blizzards now and again. Now, Rotom really is the perfect combination because an electric ghost possessing machines is brilliant. But if we were to only use one, I think it's got to be electric. This prankster is a living ball of plasma, and the original is definitely more lightning focused. I guess you could arguably give all of the other forms their additional elements as their new types, but I think the OG Gen 4 way of doing it, where they just have the attacks of those types, could work with all of them coming off of a shared electric base. But that means we just have the legendaries to do next. So firstly, we have Dialga, who is great, but I think Steel would suit this temporal Pokémon best. It's clearly coated in solid silvery armor, but it also works to contrast with Palkia, who would be Dragon. I have never understood why it's water. Zero clues in its design or lore lead it to being a water type. The best explanation I've ever heard is the states of matter, but that's a really dumb reason to make the Lord of Space such an unfitting type. Of course, this group is interrupted by Heatran, who I would make fire. While it also has some metal, there are no other fire legends in Sinnoh, and the last thing we want to do is create even more redundant legendary types. Plus, allegedly, its dome is made of lava, not steel. And we really gotta keep some fire types in Sinnoh, so I'm fine with Heatran being fire. But then back to the trio, Giratina would be best as a ghost type. Once again, Dragon is already covered, but even if it weren't, Ghost better captures the essence of the shadowy ruler of the distortion world, and gets across the malevolent nature of its renegade status. So that's it. Well, except for Shaman, I guess. Gen 4 is when they really started doing the form changes in full swing. So I guess to warrant the change, the Sky form would have to become a flying type. And of course, Arceus could still change into every type with its gimmick, but those are all of the Sinnoh Pokémon if they were only a single type. For the first time, Water is not one of the undisputed champions, even if it is still near the top. But even more surprising to me was Psychic. The last few times, Psychic pretty well maintained its status, but Sinnoh finally had it drop to the bottom half of the list. And I was actually quite impressed that Flying was so prominent as well, because I expected a lot less. But what do you think of all of the Sinnoh Pokémon as a singular type? Let me know down in the comments. Also, be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded!